Perfect. Awesome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. My name is Lizzie Meister. I'm the Public Programs Manager here at the museum, and I'm so excited to welcome you here today. And I'm excited to, in a moment, introduce Steve, our speaker, and learn about this really important story of Leo Frank and what happened in 1913 and to the present. I want to acknowledge some of our board members in the room, as well as our board members online. Boris Vince is here, and I see Jay Silverberg, and if there are other board members online, I only get 6 pictures. So thank you all for joining us today and for supporting the museum. For our virtual participants, we're hoping this holds up really well and you can see the whole experience. We invite you to ask questions in the chat, and at the end, we'll be able to answer those questions to the best of our ability. So please put those questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And for our folks in person, we're also doing a Q&A, and you can put your hand up for that one, and we'll ask you to speak. Following this conversation, there will be a small little dessert reception in our museum store with some refreshments, and books will be available for purchase.
Thank you.
We are limiting our books to 1 per registration. And if you are online, the books will be available on the museum store. And for folks in person, you can get that book signed. Without further ado, I want to introduce Steve Oney. Steve was educated at the University of Georgia and at Harvard, where he was a Nieman Fellow. He worked for many years as a staff writer for the Atlanta Journal Constitution magazine. He also contributed articles to many national publications, including Esquire, Playboy, Premiere, GQ, and the New York Times magazine. Oney lives in Los Angeles with his wife, designer Madeline Stewart. So without further ado, I want to welcome Steve up here.
I didn't get my laptop here.
It's right here if you want to have it on.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this dark and stormy night. But looks like the clouds are clearing, and with my thunderous remarks, that will, I think, blow them away. At least I hope so. Thanks to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and to Kenneth Hoffman for bringing me here, and thanks to Lizzie Meister, who you just met, who has been the Meister of ceremonies and has gotten me through all the scheduling and necessary preliminaries to put me here in front of you. I'm thrilled to be back in the South. I live in Los Angeles now, but I grew up here in Atlanta. I hope people in New Orleans think Atlanta's in the South. In truth, it's kind of not. As the great writer W.E.B. Du Bois long ago noted, Atlanta is south, of the North, but north of the South. That's certainly true today. It was also true 110 years ago when the story I want to talk to you about tonight took place. That we're discussing the Leo Frank case in 2023 is in part due to this summer's hugely successful Broadway revival of the terrific musical Parade by Alfred Uhry and Jason Robert Brown. More on that in a bit. There is also, of course, a darker reason, the uptick in anti-Semitism that is not just plaguing the South in 2023, but all of America. More on that as well. However, I'm going to start not with Parade or with today's news, but in a graveyard. If I can move this along. As I said, I grew up in the South. This is a much younger and unbearded me at Atlanta's historic Oakland Cemetery. The picture appeared in Atlanta magazine just as my book on the Leo Frank case and The Dead Shall Rise was being published. I'm kneeling in the cemetery's Jewish section between the stones of Josephine and Emil Selig. It's a peaceful spot, but it's what you don't see that makes it a historic one. This is the final resting place of Lucille Selig Frank, Emil and Josephine's daughter. There was no grave marker. There was no public service. Early one morning in 1964, Alan and Harold Marcus, Lucille's nephews, used garden tools to bury her under the cover of darkness, bury her ashes here. Alan told me about this lonely ceremony when I was working on And the Dead Shall Rise. To me, the story says everything about the impact of the Leo Frank case on Southern Jews. Here's Lucille in 1909, looking quite fetching. Here is Leo Frank, the superintendent of Atlanta's National Pencil Company in 1914. And here are Leo and Lucille together in 1909, shortly before they were married. Lucille was buried under the cover of darkness for a reason, and that reason is that on August 17th, Leo Frank was lynched. August 17th, 1915, Leo Frank was lynched in the Atlanta suburb of Marietta. Forgive this image, but it tells you why the Frank case is such a taboo topic, that there was not a funeral for Lucille Frank, and why the renewed interest in it today is so very significant. For decades, Southern Jews refused to discuss the Frank case. The only way to deal with something this terrible was to bury it. The lynching led to the formation of the modern Ku Klux Klan. The first cross burning took place on Atlanta's Stone Mountain on Thanksgiving Eve of 1915, barely 3 months after the lynching. And the case sparked the nascent Anti-Defamation League, which had come into existence 2 years earlier. However, like most subjects that we bury, the story was aching to get out. In repressing it, Southern Jews were failing to contemplate the lesson that the history of the case teaches. Tonight, I want to ponder what the case now tells us. And as I talk, I'd love it if you all would think about its relevance to our present moment. When people ask me to describe And the Dead Shall Rise in a few words, I say it's a double murder mystery and a social history. The first murder, the one that sparked the outbreak of anti-Semitism that claimed Frank's life, occurred in Atlanta in 1913. This is Mary Phagan. She was pretty, flirtatious. She was 13 years old and had no chance of attending high school, much less college. Her family was from Marietta. They were poor. Following the early death of her father, she and her mother moved to Atlanta. At 10, little Mary, as she would soon be widely known, went to work. This is the National Pencil Company in downtown Atlanta, which stood on Forsyth Street, where the Sam Nunn Federal Building is today, if you know Atlanta. In the distance, you can see the spires of Terminal Station, which was the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport of its day. If you wanted to travel any place in the South, you changed trains there. The pencil factory embodied the Industrial Revolution. Pulleys extended from the ceiling, oily black equipment crowded the floor, dust and grime choked the air. The place produced tens of thousands of pencils each week. The workforce consisted mostly of teenage girls, of whom little Mary was one. She earned 10 cents an hour inserting erasers into pencils. She was a child laborer. Leo Frank, the Cornell-educated superintendent of the factory, was her boss. On Confederate Memorial Day of 1913, April 26, Mary Phagan was murdered at the pencil factory. When Newt Lee, the night watchman, discovered her body in the basement, she was so beat up that he could not determine her race. She suffered cuts to her scalp, blood was everywhere. The cause of death, however, was strangulation. The twine at the top left of this picture was found wound tightly around her neck. Atlanta mourned the death of Mary Phagan, and she immediately became more than just a crime victim. She was a child laborer murdered in a child labor factory on Confederate Memorial Day. There was sure to be outrage, but it was amplified by the Atlanta Georgian, an afternoon Atlanta newspaper published by William Randolph Hearst. The Georgian played up the crime's most salacious angles. It suggested that the pencil company exploited workers not just economically, but sexually. It published rumors that the factory was a trysting place and that Frank took advantage of the female workers. And here's an issue of the Atlanta Georgian from that moment. On April 29th, 1913, 3 days after Little Mary's murder, Leo Frank was arrested. Even today, he'd be a suspect in the crime. He was the last person to admit seeing Mary Phagan alive. She dropped by his office on the day of the murder to pick up her pay. He was nervous when interviewed by the police. He told inconsistent stories about another early suspect, Newt Lee. However, no responsible newspaper would today identify Frank as the strangler, as the Georgian did here, which set the tone for the approach of Atlanta's other daily papers, the Constitution and the Journal. Frank was declared guilty in the press before trial. Despite all this, the case against Leo Frank was weak. What if he was the last person to admit seeing Mary Phagan alive? That was a coincidence. What if he was anxious? It was a terrible crime. The case against Leo Frank hardened with the appearance of the man I call the star witness here. And I'm sort of hung up.
Sorry. Okay.
Jim Conley. It also became stranger and more volatile. Conley was the pencil company janitor. He was a petty criminal and a drunk. 2 days after the Phagan murder, he was taken into custody when he was seen at the factory washing red stains out of a work shirt. The shirt, unfortunately, was not tested for blood. After being held on suspicion for a month, Conley confessed to being responsible for the most important clues in the Frank case, clues that Conley said pointed the finger at Leo Frank. When the Atlanta police discovered Mary Phagan's body, they found alongside it 2 cryptic notes. Taken literally, the notes suggest that little Mary wrote them in her death throes. But from the start, no one accepted that view. To me, the murder notes, as they became known, are endlessly fascinating. Quite apart from being clues in a murder case, they are encoded with the mysteries of sex and race. I'll read the one you're looking at. Ma'am, that Negro hire, or maybe fire, down here did this. I went to make water, and he pushed me down that hole. A long, tall Negro, that who it was, long, slim, tall Negro. I write while play with me. And here's the other murder note, just so you can see what they were like. One was on an old order pad at the pencil factory, the first one you saw. And this is just a lined sheet of notepaper. After weeks of fierce interrogation, Conley told the police that Leo Frank dictated these notes to him and asked him to place them beside Mary Phagan's body. Frank's hope, Conley said, was to point suspicion at the pencil company's boiler operator, a dark-complected Black man named William Oney. To some, Conley's stories raised red flags. He was light-skinned and short, not black and long. He could have written the notes to divert suspicion from himself. Most, however, believed Conley was telling the truth. He was just the type Leo Frank would have recruited. Killers do not seek help from good citizens. As the trial approached, the city awaited an unprecedented event, a Black man testifying against a Jew in a capital case. This is downtown Atlanta at the time of the Leo Frank case. The shot was taken during a shrine convention, hence all the banners and stars, but in every other way, this is what Atlanta looked like when Frank was on trial. There was a circus atmosphere throughout the city. This is Hugh Dorsey, the Solicitor General of Fulton County, as chief prosecuting officers in Atlanta were then called. He was Leo Frank's prosecutor. He was a country boy who cleaned up nice. This is Leo Frank's lead counsel, Luther Rosser. He was part of Atlanta's establishment. He represented the Georgia Power Company, which in 1913, much like it is today, under its new name, the Southern Company, was tied up in constant litigation. Only then it wasn't about nuclear power. It was about hydroelectric plants in the North Georgia mountains. This is Frank's second chair lawyer, Reuben Arnold, Mr. Rube, as he was known in the old-fashioned Southern way. His main client was the afternoon paper, the Atlanta Journal. I show you these pictures to emphasize the conflict inherent in the Frank trial. It pitted populace against elites. Like Little Mary, Dorsey had red clay on his heels. Like Frank, Rosser and Arnold were part of a forward-looking group dragging the South into the modern world. Here we see Hugh Dorsey examining Newt Lee on the trial's opening day. If you look carefully, you can see Leo and Lucille sitting just in front of the judge's bench. And the funny black object on the rail in front of you is a precursor of the air conditioning machine. It was called an ozonator. It pumped fresh ozone into the courtroom. It did not work. The trial was held with a constant 90-degree or plus temperature inside. A trial of this length that went on for a month was unheard of at the time. I devote 3 chapters to it in And the Dead Shall Rise. I did so in part because the transcript of the trial has disappeared, and I took it upon myself to reconstruct it from the verbatim accounts that appeared in the daily newspapers. This was a point of pride. I also think the trial was so dramatic that it deserved such treatment, but don't be alarmed. I'm going to spare you most of the details and say simply the trial turned on just a few issues. 1, Leo Frank's movements on the day of Mary Phagan's murder and the exact time of her death. 2, Jim Conley's testimony as to what happened. 3, the defense's cross-examination of Conley. 4, Frank's character, good or bad. And 5, Frank's Jewishness. First, Frank maintained that he was alone at his desk on April 26th, the day of the murder, catching up on some paperwork. Mary Phagan, he said, stopped at his office shortly after noon to get her wages, $1.20. Wages were paid in cash then, in an envelope. He said he handed her the envelope and she walked away. He said he never left his desk. Montine Stover, another factory girl, contradicted him. She testified she got to Frank's office around noon and he wasn't there. The state's theory was that Frank lured Little Mary deep into the factory on the same floor as his office in hopes of seducing her. The state's medical experts testified that the murder occurred shortly after noon. Second, Jim Conley testified that Frank recruited him to stand watch while he seduced Mary Phagan. The most shocking thing about the charge is that Conley spoke graphically about Frank's alleged sexual preferences. He said Frank was not built like any other man he'd seen who had children. He said Frank, as a consequence, preferred oral sex. Conley meant that because of circumcision, Frank was incapable of biblical intercourse. Conley added that Frank murdered Little Mary after she resisted him. Conley said Frank gave him money to write the notes and dispose of the body. During cross-examination, Luther Rosser, the defense lawyer, hoping to trip Conley up, encouraged him to tell of other times he stood watch for Leo Frank. Conley obliged, suggesting that Frank was a serial seducer. Conley was on the stand 3 days. He left the impression that Frank was a deviant. In the face of Conley's devastating allegations, the defense put Leo Frank's character into evidence. calling dozens of Atlanta Jews to testify to his good works in the community and his high position in the business world. This was an extraordinarily risky tactic, as it allowed the prosecution to call factory girls to testify to Frank's bad character and his unsavory reputation around the building. The defense declined to cross-examine these girls. During his closing argument, Reuben Arnold, the number 2 chair in the defense, articulated the issue that had gone unspoken throughout the entire case: anti-Semitism. And this is what Arnold told the jury. "I tell everybody, all within the hearing of my voice, that if Frank hadn't been a Jew, he never would have been prosecuted. I'm asking my kind of people to give this man fair play." The defense did not, however, have the last word. In his closing argument, Hugh Dorsey maintained that the prosecution was not anti-Semitic and that Frank was driven by aberrant sexual appetites. "Frank killed little Mary when she resisted," he said. After brief deliberation, the jury voted to convict Frank. Judge Leonard Roan sentenced him to death by hanging. And this is just the start of the story. A couple of weeks after the conviction, David Marks, who you see here, a New Orleans native, and I don't know whether there's anyone here who knows the Marks family, but he was the rabbi of Atlanta's Reform Synagogue, the Temple. He got on a train for New York, and he wanted to alert America's leading Jews to what he saw as the anti-Semitic persecution of Leo Frank. Marks and his allies eventually secured audiences with Adolph Ochs, publisher of the New York Times, and Albert D. Lasker, probably the greatest advertising executive of the 20th century, founder of an agency called Lord and Thomas, which became the current concern Foote Konen building. This is Adolph Ochs in his heyday. Initially, Ochs was unreceptive. He was Jewish, but he resisted any effort to make the Times what he called a Jewish newspaper, something he feared. This is A.D. Lasker. He was instantly moved by Frank's plight and alerted such fellow Jewish business titans as Julius Rosenwald, chairman of Sears Roebuck. At the start, America's Jews debated how to proceed. Should they try to prove Frank's innocence, or should they try to show he was a victim of anti-Semitism? They tried both. With funding from Lasker, they hired Lewis Marshall, founder of the American Jewish Committee, to handle Frank's appeals as a strictly legal matter. Meantime, Lasker worked the Jewish angle in the media. Despite his initial resistance, Adolph Ochs was ultimately all in. The Times took sides on the Frank case, not just on its editorial page, but in its news columns. In December of 1914, for instance, the paper ran 28 stories and 5 editorials on the Frank case. Ochs saw this as a crusade to free a wrongly convicted man. Ochs also saw this as taking up the burden for his Southern kinsmen. Ochs grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. He got his start in journalism as the founder of the Chattanooga Times. Others didn't see it quite so grandly. There was no fiercer adversary than Tom Watson. A defense lawyer and former congressman, he was publisher of the Weekly Jeffersonian in Thomaston, Georgia, just outside Augusta. When the Times and others took up Frank's cause, he went to war. In every issue of the Jeffersonian for a year, he rebutted the Times stories, laying out the case for the conviction of Leo Frank and attacking Frank's Jewish champions. Here's a snippet from Watson. The question is, do the rich Jews want to create among the Gentiles of this country the same deep dislike which they have created everywhere else? Is this lewd, loathsome murderer worth the price? Here's another snippet from Watson, and it ends with a threat. If Frank's rich connections keep on lying about this case, something bad will happen. And the Jeffersonian circulation tripled during Watson's embrace of the Frank case. and stacks of it would come into small towns on the train and would sell out immediately. And it really was an early instance of the kind of divergence we see today about fake news and differing versions of the facts. There were two versions of the facts in the Frank case now circulating. There was the fact-driven version in the New York Times and mostly other northern newspapers, and then there was Tom Watson's version. And while Tom Watson owned only a small weekly, it was as powerful as InfoWars, maybe more powerful. So the Frank case during this cause celeb, when it's a matter of the press, is also in the courts. And in the spring of 1915, after Frank had lost appeals at every single state court and at several lower federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court took up the case and ruled against Frank's final appeal. His case then went to the Georgia Board of Pardon and Paroles. It also ruled against him. Frank had one last chance. His lawyers asked the governor to commute Frank's sentence to life imprisonment. This is Governor John Slayton at the time of the case. He was a wealthy, wealthy man. At the time of his governorship, the governor's mansion in Georgia was in downtown Atlanta, but he lived on an estate in ritzy Buckhead near what is now Slayton and Paces Ferry Road. The Frank case presented a major conflict of interest to him. His law partner was Luther Rosser, Frank's lead counsel. For many in Georgia, that was a deal breaker. But I think Slayton was driven by conscience. Also, the Atlanta and Georgia bar were so small in 1915 that anyone involved in this case had some sort of conflict of interest. Slayton held hearings on the Frank case, and he became convinced of Frank's innocence. He believed that Jim Conley was the sole author of the murder notes and hence the author of the murders. He was also obsessed with an unsavory piece of evidence. Conley testified during the trial that when he transported Mary Phagan's body from where he said he'd found it near Frank's office to the pencil factory basement where the police found it, he used the factory elevator. He also testified that he defecated at the bottom of the elevator shaft the day of the crime. Slayton spent time at the factory running the elevator up and down to see if it touched the bottom of the shaft. It did, which was critical. The detectives assigned to the Phagan murder could smell Conley's feces in the shaft. They were fresh when they came the morning they found Mary Phagan's body. If Conley had used the elevator to transport the victim's body, they would have been mashed. And this became one of the most unsavory but fascinating pieces of evidence in the murder, the shit in the shaft. And it convinced Slayton that Conley had not only lied about it, but that if he'd lied about it, he very well lied about everything else. Slayton decided to take a stand. In a speech after commuting the sentence, he told the press, it's a pretty amazing statement. Honest people may disagree with me, but we realize that we must be measured by our consciences. 2,000 years ago, another governor washed his hand of a case and turned a Jew over to a mob. If today another Jew were lying in his grave because I had failed to do my duty, I would consider myself an assassin through cowardice. Well, this is how Georgia reacted to Governor Slayton's statement and his finding. This is just outside Atlanta in the today wealthy suburban community of Gwinnett County. And if you can't read it, it says John M. Slayton, the King of Jews. And so Slayton was hung in effigy here. He was hung in effigy all over the state. Sometimes they just took the effigy and put it behind a car and set it on fire and drove him around the courthouse square. Every town had its own style of effigies, I guess, its own signature effigies. Slayton, incidentally, was never again elected to office in Georgia, even though he was a young man. He ran for the Senate in the early 1930s. Georgia was in on the county unit system. There are 159 counties in Georgia. He took 2. Milledgeville. Milledgeville, Georgia. You think of it, Flannery O'Connor lived there. She memorialized it in her novels and stories. But in 1915, it was more famous as the home of the Georgia Prison Farm, the state prison. And a few hours before Frank was publicly commuted, Slayton ordered him shipped there. He was now a state prisoner. He was no longer a county prisoner in Atlanta. And this is the prison dormitory, which was relatively new then. It was quite a showplace with indoor plumbing and working showers, and mostly white-collar criminals slept in these barracks. Georgia was still pretty primitive in its treatment of more violent felons. They ended up on county-maintained chain gangs building roads around the state. This is the interior of the prison where the inmates slept in dormitory-style barracks and fresh sheets and high windows. It was, as prisons go, a pretty nice prison. By the time Frank got here, this case was on the front page of every newspaper in America. It was in newsreels. It was in major magazine articles. There were mass meetings in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston. Pleas for Frank's commutation or pardon came in by the hundreds of thousands to Governor Slayton's office. And this is a very rare picture right here. This is director Hal Reed, who came down to Georgia to make a documentary film about the Frank case in the summer of 1915. And this is Frank being interviewed by Hal Reed in the warden's office in Milledgeville. And Hal Reed was the father of a famous silent film star, Wallace Reed, and Hal Reed was pretty well known himself. And he worked hard on this documentary and sent film crews all over the state of Georgia, getting different shots and different footage to include in it. This is another still from the movie. You can see Frank is sitting in front of a Coca-Cola calendar and reading God knows what. But this film opened in New York and played at a number of theaters. And I was telling some of the folks here in the museum that the prints have disappeared. This is a holy grail of Leo Frank scholarship. If you could discover a still usable print of this picture, you'd have quite a piece of history. The film was incidentally distributed by the Lowe's chain, which is still in business. And the owner of the chain, founder Marcus Lowe, was alive. And Tom Watson, as soon as the film aired, it was screened, portraying modern technology. Watson just said, he's a worthy descendant of Moses who undoubtedly loves money. So the case has become, by this point, so hot, almost unbelievably, brutally debated, contested. The entire country is talking about it. And Frank is now at the Milledgeville State Prison, supposedly safe from harm. But he wasn't. In the first commutation issue of the Jeffersonian, Tom Watson called for Leo Frank's lynching. Whether he was actually involved in the crime remains a mystery. But he said when Slayton commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, the forms of law had been broken. And when the forms of law were broken, it was time for the people to take the law into their own hands. Again, think about the resonance for today. A number of powerful surrogates of Tom Watson did just that, took this into their own hands. And most of them were from Mary Phagan's hometown of Marietta. The young man pictured here at the wheel is Herbert Clay, the son of United States Senator Alexander Stevens Clay, the brother of future U.S. General and aide to Dwight Eisenhower, Lucius Clay. And Herbert, at the time of the Frank case, was Solicitor General of the old Blue Ridge Circuit Court, which extended from just above Atlanta up to the Tennessee line. Herbert was a scamp. He flunked out of the University of Georgia due to excessive drinking. Another similarity between now and then, that did not hurt him. He was charming, persuasive, well-connected, and he was one of the main organizers of the lynching. Now, this picture of the severe-looking man on the left was taken on a boat in New York Harbor during the 1924 Democratic Party convention, and it shows Newt Morris, the shorter of the two men. He was the former judge of the old Blue Ridge Circuit, and where Herbert Clay was an enthusiast, Judge Newt was a taskmaster. In And the Dead Shall Rise, I quote an old-time Marietta lawyer who I was lucky enough to interview and who'd done some business with Newt ages ago. He told me, when I asked him what kind of fellow he was, he said, a 24-carat son of a bitch with spare parts. And Frank's lynching would not have happened without Judge Newt. So you had sort of the two poles of the Southern character galvanizing the lynch party. You had the enthusiast Herbert Clay. He was drunk on the moonshine of lynching Leo Frank. And then you had the authoritarian ruler of the town, the small town potentate, Judge Newt. Getting to the bottom of all this was fascinating for me. Early in my work, I interviewed Herbert's only son, Eugene, who was a lawyer down in Sarasota. And I asked him if his father had helped to lynch Leo Frank, and he told me through tears that he believed he had. He then agreed to meet me in Marietta, where we spent a long weekend talking with anyone who could shed any light on this. And there were plenty of people who could. Conversely, Judge Newt's three children, like their dad, were pretty tough, and they stonewalled me. Although in different ways, they helped me understand the lynching too. One son, George, told me that he'd ridden his bicycle to the site just minutes after Frank had been lynched, just minutes after he had died. And I thought, that doesn't help me. And then I pondered it and I thought, that's actually quite fascinating, because how at 7 a.m. would he have known that a lynching had taken place a couple of miles from his house? His dad told him. Ultimately, I interviewed the children of 8 participants in or planners of the lynching. I interviewed 3 people whose youngsters went out to the lynch site and saw Frank's body hanging. The lynching was carried out by 25 very well-respected Marietta men, selected by Clay, Morris, and other power brokers. And use that term, power broker. What does it mean? Well, one of the lynching planners was a lawyer named John Tucker Dorsey, John Tuck. And John Dorsey's son was the CEO of Southern Bell Telephone through the 1980s, Jasper Dorsey, until the Bells broke up. And Jasper was head of the Alumni Association at my university, University of Georgia, the Grady College of Journalism. So these people had connections throughout the state. And I don't know whether Jasper ever knew that his father was involved, but it was people of that rank who organized the lynching. The lynch party raid on Milledgeville was conducted with military precision. You couldn't even call this a lynch mob. This was an organized attack on a state institution. The lynch party traveled a circuitous 300-mile route, mostly on unpaved roads. They skirted far away from Atlanta, which would have been the direct route to Milledgeville. The leaders greased the palms of sheriffs along the way, and prison officials were held in check by the state legislature, which promised to release construction funds if the plot went off successfully, which sadly it did. By mid-morning on August 17th, 1915, thousands of people had descended on the lynch site. The actual killers were long gone. They'd driven to a fish camp north of Marietta to establish an alibi. The crowd then rushed to the Marietta Courthouse Square a mile away. And this is the crowd celebrating Leo Frank's lynching on the courthouse square later on the day of the crime. The lynching captivated the world. Front page news stories, giant headlines. This cartoon appeared in Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. I mean, if you're an advocate of the state of Georgia, it's pretty tough to take, but this particular version of the picture ran in Tom Watson's magazine, hence the caption, "Jew-owned, how they see us." This is Lucille Frank, devastated in grief, being escorted from the Frank family brownstone in Brooklyn to the cars that will leave for the cemetery. This is Leo Frank's grave in Queens. And there's a Latin inscription at the bottom that doesn't quite show in this photograph, but it says Semper Idem, which translates always the same, meaning that anti-Semitism predates this and postdates it. And this is Mary Phagan's grave in the Marietta City Cemetery. I'm absolutely mesmerized by this picture. It's encoded with so much information. It was taken just after the lynching, and the image of the man on the left was purposely obscured by the photographer, probably because the man was a lynch party participant. He's holding a branch of the oak tree from which Frank was executed and a photograph of Frank's body taken minutes after the lynching. And together, all these elements send an unmistakable signal: retribution. This was conceived by and carried out by Georgians who believed that they were avenging miscarriage of justice, misguided or not, that's what they believed. Of all the people in the Frank case, and there are a lot of fascinating people, reporters, lawyers, criminals, witnesses, a whole cross-section of the South of that era. The one I sympathize most with is Lucille Frank, and this is Lucille circa 1955, not long before her death. She was only 27 when Leo was lynched. She was, as you might imagine, broken. She went through more before she turned 30 than I hope most of us go through in our healthy and long lives. She consulted psychics. She briefly moved to Memphis to work in a dress shop owned by a brother-in-law. After a few years, she came back to Atlanta, where she worked in the glove department of an elegant boutique on Peachtree Street. During my research, I interviewed Dr. James Kaufman, an internist who set up practice in Atlanta not long after World War II, and he was Lucille's physician for the last decade of her life. He told me she suffered from many psychosomatic symptoms. She sometimes burst inexplicably into sobs. Other times she lashed out in anger if you just said the wrong word. Kaufman urged her to see a psychiatrist. She did not. Now we're back to where we started. Lucille died in 1957 of congestive heart disease. She wanted her ashes scattered in an Atlanta city park, but there was an ordinance against it. So the ashes were stored in a box in a downtown funeral home. After an inventory by the funeral home, its owners asked the Marcus brothers, Lucille's nephews, to take charge of the ashes. They didn't know what to do when handed this box of cremains. In 1958, the temple, the main Reformed synagogue in Atlanta, of which Leo and Lucille Frank were members, was bombed. Luckily, there was no one in the building, so there were no injuries, but it was a frightening moment. And the more you look into the temple bombing, the more you realize it was a precursor of much of the violence during the Civil Rights era. The people involved in the temple bombing were involved in much of the violence in Alabama. So this had happened a year after Lucille died. The family's in possession of these ashes. There's not been a funeral. All of the Jews of Atlanta were, especially those who'd lived through the Frank case, were overwrought. So Allen placed Lucille's ashes in the trunk of his hot red Corvair. And for years, his son raced them around Atlanta. So this was driving Miss Lucille. She was on a ride. In 1964, Harold and Alan Marcus finally decided to give Lucille a burial. So they buried her here in Oakland Cemetery. They were afraid to bring new attention to the Frank case. Fear still gripped them, as it did so many other Atlanta Jews. it wasn't over. So this is until 2020, Atlanta's Fulton County Solicitor General, or District Attorney, they now call him, Paul Howard. In 2019, Paul Howard reopened the Frank case. He believed he could find new evidence that would exonerate Leo Frank. The next year, however, he lost his reelection bid to Fani Willis, who's now prosecuting Donald Trump, for his alleged violations on January 6th. And she's put the case on the back burner. This is Roy Barnes, the last liberal Democrat to be elected governor of Georgia. And Roy was going to help Paul Howard reinvestigate this case. And he did so because he has a very special interest in it. Roy, you may know, is the governor responsible for taking the Confederate battle flag off the state of Georgia flag in the 1990s. That destroyed his career. And in many ways, he feels kinship to Governor Slayton in his decision. And there's another reason he's so fascinated by the Frank case and wants to make amends. His wife's grandfather was in the lynch party. So Governor Barnes is still out there trying to get someone to pay attention to this. This is not the first time the Frank case has been reopened. In 1982, lawyers working for the Anti-Defamation League applied for a posthumous pardon for Frank. It was based on new evidence provided by Alonzo Mann, who you see here. Lonnie, as most people called him, was Leo Frank's office boy. He was at the pencil factory on the day of the crime, and he swore he saw Jim Conley toting little Mary's body. And he said that Conley reached out to him and in a threatening voice said, "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you." I knew Alonzo Mann. It is because of him that I got interested in the Frank case. I interviewed him at a VA hospital in Mountain View, Tennessee, a long time ago, 1984. He was dying of heart failure, but he was well enough to tell me about the burden he'd carried all his life. The burden of not speaking up about Jim Conley at Frank's trial. Based on Lonnie's recollections, I wrote an article for Esquire about the Frank saga. I then signed a book contract and ultimately produced And the Dead Shall Rise. In the end, the Georgia Board of Pardon and Paroles did not think Alonzo Mann's story offered enough new evidence to overturn Leo Frank's conviction. Instead, 2 years later, the board issued an apology for the state's failure to protect Leo Frank when he was a state's prisoner. Where does that leave us? I'm not sure. I spent 17 years looking into every part of the case. Is there something new out there? I don't know. Every once in a while, fresh evidence does show up. These are the keys to the Millersville prison. They belong to J.E. Smith, the warden, whose name you can see there on the key ring. They're fascinating. They were donated to the Bremen Museum in Atlanta a few years ago, but do they prove anything? No, they're a curiosity. So the Frank case will not go away. In part, most recently, that's due to the summer successful revival of Parade on Broadway. It's reintroduced the story to the public and introduced it to people who don't know anything about it. A lot of people don't know anything about Leo Frank. Maybe this public attention will re-energize the Fulton County probe that Fani Willis may pick up when she's done with Donald Trump. The Frank case is back, sadly, in the news as well. This is an anti-Semitic protest outside of a conservative synagogue in Marietta back in July. And protests like this have happened all over the country, using Leo Frank's name, and hard to believe that someone from 1915 would still be part of a campaign like this, but in Beverly Hills, Santa Barbara, and New York, the typical refrain in most of these protests is that Leo Frank was kind of a Jeffrey Epstein prototype, that he was a sexual predator and that Jeffrey Epstein and Leo Frank are somehow cut from the same cloth. What should those do who wish to exonerate Frank in such a poisonous atmosphere? My suggestion is that they consult a study of the murder notes conducted by William Smith. This is William Smith here. He was Jim Conley's lawyer, and he got Conley off as an accessory after the fact to murder. Conley served 1 year. Then Smith began to worry. He believed that his client, Jim Conley, had murdered Mary Phagan. For months, Smith studied the murder notes that we talked about, comparing their language to that of every piece of Conley's other written and spoken remarks. Conley, and I did some serious research on this when I was doing the book, was far more literate than he or his writings led on. He had attended several years at a couple of the best Black elementary schools in Atlanta. He could read and write. He knew his way around. He read the newspapers. And in Smith's study, the letters and conversation he sampled from Jim Conley matched these murder notes. Conley always used compound adjectives, long, tall, black. He made the same misspellings in his written remarks as he did in these notes. Conley, Smith decided, was the author of the murder notes, which made him the author of Mary Phagan's murder. Smith went public with these findings shortly before the case went to Governor Slayton. He influenced Slayton's decision to commute. The action was controversial. Smith's law practice was destroyed. Smith moved to New York, returning to Georgia in the 1940s. He died at Crawford Long Hospital in in Atlanta in 1949. And on his deathbed, he wrote this note. This is one of his last utterances in his life. It says, in Articles of Death, I believe in the innocence and good character of Leo M. Frank. And if you look at the note closely, he wrote it on the back of a hospital prescription slip. You can see the ghosts of the writing on the other side coming through. I think it's very powerful. I built a lot of my book about William Smith's study of the murder notes and then his change of mind. So there's a movement to exonerate Frank, both in the courts in Atlanta and among many Southern Jews. But what would it mean if he was exonerated? The larger issues will remain. Why and how did this case get out of hand? This is the past question to us, prompting us to contemplate the relationship between then and now. The differences between 1915 and 2023 are many. Yet, there are great similarities. Then as now, there was tremendous confusion in the world. Then the agrarian age was ending, the industrial age was starting, just as the industrial age is now ending and the information age has seized us. There were then conflicting sources of news, alternative facts. Europe was in chaos, as it is now. The forms of law itself were under attack. Tribalism, although no one would have used that word in 1915, was emerging. History tells us that divisive times breed anti-Semitism. Could there be another Leo Frank case? A decade ago, I would have said, absolutely not. Society was sufficiently stable to hold the demons at bay. Now I'm not that sure. In 2022, the Anti-Defamation League reported 3,697 attacks on American Jews or Jewish institutions. That's 900 more than in 2021, which was a lot more than the year before. That's a hard figure to ignore. I don't believe Jews should cower, but I do believe it's time for vigilance, and not just by Jews, by all of us. The Constitution matters. The rule of law matters. It is not a far distance from Frank's lynching to the events of January 1st at the US Capitol. The dark forces that claimed Leo Frank are alive again. And again, I'm saying we shouldn't cower, we shouldn't change our lives, but I think to the extent that we can, we should all be advocates of the truth and beacons of hope. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
We're now going to open it up for a little
Can I
bit
do
of.
one more thing? I've got an unbelievable piece of good fortune today. I walked in here and at the front desk, I met Mark Rubin, a singer and guitarist and songwriter. And Mark has written a ballad about Leo Frank. And I just thought this was such kismet that Mark would be sitting out in the front desk that I asked him if he'd be so kind, if he'd come up here and play it for us and sing it for us. So Mark Rubin, folks, you're in for a treat.
Tell me where you want to stand and I'm gonna make sure the camera's pointed to you.
Okay, howdy, friends and neighbors. My name is Mark Rubin, and it's my honor here to work the door here. But in my life, in my musical life, I perform under the name Mark Rubin Jew of Oklahoma, which is funny because they were happy to see me go. But on a less happy story, you know, I was one of those Jewish people who didn't know about Leo Frank. And what I found out through the Ballad of Mary Phagan, because I was a folk singer and I knew all about the Ballad of Mary Phagan, and then learned about Leo Frank from that name. But this is when I found out, did more and more research about the Leo Frank story, became more and more aware that more Jewish folks ought to know about it. Now, as I'm going to tell you the story is called The Murder of Leo Frank. Trigger warning, images of a lynching. And so just to let you know. Come gather around, people, a story has to tell. I sing today of Leo Frank, it's a tale not told so well. They might have heard the ballad, I might have sung the song of the half-poor little Mary Phagan, and how it was shit these shows wrong. Well, my song is not about the crime, about the so-called trial, where Leo Frank, the innocent, was found guilty in a given time. Now Leo Frank's been gone, but his memory lingers on. Convicted by all press accounts, railroaded by the courts, thousands came from all around for Frank's life to make sport. And out on the courthouse steps, old John Carson could be heard, making songs right up on the spot for the thousands gathered there. He sang, let's hang that little Jew. Come on, let's hang that little Jew. He sang, let's hang that little Jew. Let's hang that little Jew. It was on the 17th of August. It was on that fateful day, 6 cars filled up with angry men to the Milledgeville prison came. Well, they drained the gas tanks of the cops, cut down the telephone wires, and cuffed the friendly warden. With Frank, they bid goodbye. It was out in Marietta, and a spot did they prepare there for all the Frank and a length of rope and a rickety old chair. Well, now your Frank's been gone, but his memory lingers on. Now then, when the killing had been done, all the men they gathered round to get a picture of themselves with Frank's body dangling down. There were prominent politicians, sheriffs, policemen too, well, the captains of local industry, and the founder of the local scout troop. And all the clansmen cried with glee, burn across an old stone mountain for all the world to see. They cried, we hung that little Jew. We hung that little Jew. We hung that little Jew. Well, they hung that little Jew. Well, now the Jews of old Atlanta, well, they thought they'd had it made, but now hundreds fled old Georgia, for a state of the northern state. There'll be no menorah in your window, no more snooker built outside. Thames that did not lead right out, learn to hide it. Hide it deep down in Frank's been gone, but his memory lingers. Well, now for little Mary Phagan songs on Carson can we thank? But next time you're at services, they are cottage for legal. Frank.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank Mark and Steve. We have time for just a few questions. And so I'm going to start with folks in person, and I'm going to read some of these Zoom questions. But if you would like to come back into the camera, we have a question right up here.
Hi,
I love your lecture.
thank you.
I love details and look forward to reading this book.
Well, it's got some details.
Do you feel that you've come to know Leo Frank as a person? Do you think you would understand what he was like and what he went through?
That's a great question. It's, do I know Leo Frank as a person? And that was one of the hardest things in my research. Leo Frank was a typical mechanical engineer. He played his cards very close to his vest. After Frank died, someone mentioned in a letter that he was a student, at least when he was in prison, of the Greek poet Epictetus, who was one of the founders of Stoicism. And the Stoics also played everything close to their vest. They felt that life dealt us hardship in order to teach us. And Frank was, those are the more noble aspects, but he was arrogant. I don't think he understood just what a stranger in a strange land he was when he came down from Cornell to take over a factory in Atlanta, Georgia, fewer than 50 years after the end of the Civil War, and what that might represent. Even though he was part of the vanguard of capital coming to Georgia to bring it into the modern age and light, he was on hostile soil. But he's a hard guy to know, and his writings are brief, cryptic. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was an engineer. He wasn't going to waste a lot of breath on poetic effusions, but I know him a little bit, and I think you'll see, I worked on the book long enough to find a lot of his letters. So I quote him at length, and I've got a whole series of back and forth in chapter 5 between Leo and Lucille when they were courting. So you're getting, she's gone away to the college town of Athens, Georgia, where her brothers owned a department store. She's there visiting, and Leo's in Atlanta and feeling lonesome, and they're writing back and forth. So that gives you a sense of his heart a little bit.
And we have a question from online. Was the pay envelope found on the body? I was under the impression the janitor's motive was robbery.
The pay envelope was not found. There were debates about pieces of the pay envelope being found in the factory, but they were never proven to the satisfaction of anyone that they were pieces of the actual envelope. They'd have little bits and ends of it. But the prosecution argued that Frank's motive was sex, that Frank was attempting to seduce Mary Phagan. The defense argued that the motive was robbery, that Jim Conley robbed Mary Phagan as she was coming out of Frank's office with only $1.20. But Conley was drunk, he was broke, he was spending a lot of money on booze throughout that weekend, and people got receipts from different bars he had visited. But no, the two key pieces of witness or evidence disappeared. One was the note, and two, Mary Phagan had a mesh clutch purse in her hand because it was Confederate Memorial Day and she was going to trade and wanted to have a nice purse, and the purse disappeared. And that people say tends to suggest Conley stole the purse, because why would Leo Frank want a mesh purse? But Conley would have thought that was a gift that he could use someplace. Yes, sir.
So I have two questions. One, I'm curious, did Leo Frank ever take the stand? And two, can you expound a little bit on, you mentioned that it was a piece I wasn't familiar with, but it sounded like money was withheld for construction. So it implies that the police, or there was some sort of governmental element that was helping support the lynching. Can you explain that piece?
First, Leo Frank took the stand, but he did something that was then legal in Georgia. He made an unsworn statement that the jury could decide to ignore or use. And in that statement, he declared his innocence. The risk of a tactic like that is he didn't put himself open to cross-examination, so it was only his version. And then there was a double risk, and this goes to your question about Frank's personality. He gets into his statement, and he refuses to address the murder or Mary Phagan. He talks for maybe 15 minutes about the accounting techniques he used at the factory and how he balanced the books and various ways that he would establish the percentages owed to the sales staff. He said he was doing it because his argument was that on that Saturday of the murder, he was so busy, he was so overwhelmed with the paperwork that went out every Saturday at the end of the week, he couldn't have had any time to do this crime. And that's a story he's clung to throughout. But to the jury, it looked like a massive case of avoidance, that he was, ratcheting on about these figures like a mechanical man. Like, he even used the word data. Can you imagine how the word data played in a 1913 courtroom in the South? As to the other question, this is, I think, one of the big reveals in my book. The state of Georgia lynched Leo Frank. It was an off-the-books lynching. Tom Watson called for the lynching. These powerful politicians in Marietta and business people organized the lynch party, and then they got workers and farmers and mechanics and a sheriff and a couple of other middle class or lower class guys to carry it out. But the state funded a lot of it, and the state prison was then trying to expand, and the legislature of the state funded expansion for the prison. The funding went through a couple of weeks after the lynching. And if you look at this, and I plotted it out as best I could, but nobody's alive, so there was no one I could ask about it. But the state legislator in charge of the prison committee was this fellow I mentioned, John Tucker Dorsey, whose son Jasper was later the CEO of Southern Bell. Well, John Tucker Dorsey was part of the planning committee for the lynching, and John Tucker Dorsey was riding herd over this monetary appropriation by the legislature to the prison. So the warden of the prison actually was friendly with Frank and believed he was innocent, but the state was using whatever leverage it had to push this thing through. And at the time this came out in my book, I thought it was going to make bigger news in Georgia, but a long time ago, it goes under the duly noted column, I guess.
Just in the interest of time, I hate to do this, but we have one more question. Is there someone in the?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Actually, this is a two-part question. If I understood what you said, the media really drove a lot of this.
It did. The first part of the media equation is the coverage of Mary Phagan's murder. And the Hearst newspaper drove that, but the Hearst newspaper had no ideology. The Hearst newspaper disseminated pure sensation. And I've got a quote from a very well-read woman who talked to one of the detectives, and he observed about her, she is well-read to the extent she is crazy, because she was reading, like somebody constantly toggling back and forth among sites online. She was reading the paper. So the first part of the story is raw sensation creates hysteria in a small or big southern town or small southern city. The second part is that when this case became a cause celeb, there were alternate facts. There were two versions of the case. There was the version that Adolph Ox wrote about, or had his reporters write about in the New York Times day after day. And then there was Tom Watson's version, which said that the New York Times and other Jewish-owned northern papers, and not just Jewish-owned papers, Watson ended up attacking the mainstream Atlanta papers. Even the Atlanta Georgian came out in favor of commutation of Frank's sentence. So they'd set the fire, but they tried to put it out. So that's when things degenerated, when there were divergent versions of the truth. And Southerners felt that the mainstream media, a term that didn't exist then, that Southerners felt that these big urban papers were dictating to them, and they resented it.
My second question is, once again, if I understood what you said, during the trial, they tried to present evidence that Leo Frank had tried to seduce other women.
Mhm.
Did anyone say that he did?
No one said he did. It was all scuttlebutt, rumor, inference. And the defense made a terrible mistake. During the defense cross-examination of Jim Conley, the key witness, the defense lawyer Luther Rosser asked Conley about multiple times that Conley stood guard for Frank while Frank was allegedly seducing women. And Conley just blithely rattled off 4 or 5 other times he'd done it, with descriptions of what the women were wearing. And suddenly the defense had made a terrible tactical mistake, because they'd introduced this. Frank was on trial for murder, not for any sexual misconduct. And the next day, the defense asked that this be stricken from the record, and the judge removed the jury and considered it. And he said, ultimately, that he was going to let it stay because it could be stricken from the record, but not from the minds of anyone who was in that room.
So have courtroom standards tightened up since then? It sounds like the kind of stuff that we just discussed could not happen in the modern court.
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, surely compared to that court, it was in a temporary courthouse. It was hot as Hades. The windows were thrown open because the ozonators didn't work. And there was new construction going on right around the courthouse. In fact, the new Fulton County Courthouse that's still in use today was being built. And there were construction sheds all along the construction site. So gawkers were standing on the construction sheds looking right into the courtroom at eye level. So it was like a fishbowl. And when Dorsey scored certain points, the crowd outside would applaud. And I mean, it was whatever you think about whether Frank was guilty or not, he did not get a fair trial by anyone's standards.
And that's what I'm thinking, is that the standards of trials back then must not have been strict as they are today. Because a lot of what we're hearing sounds.
Well, it depends how information gets into a courtroom now. I mean, I just saw that Murdoch's lawyers in South Carolina are appealing because they say the court poisoned the jurors, that the clerk of court. So nothing's airtight.
I hate to be the person who has to do this, but I'm gonna thank Steve so much for giving a wonderful presentation. Folks in person, there will be a book signing, and if you have more questions, maybe he'll answer them. I'm not sure. And I want to thank Mark Rubin for that interesting and beautiful and touching rendition of his song, The Ballad of Leo Frank. And I want to thank everybody here online. It looks like our internet stayed through despite the inclement weather, so that's fantastic. A recording of this presentation, slightly edited, will be available in the coming days. And if you would like to keep up with us here at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, please follow us online. We're on all the socials. The best way to keep up with, though, is staying on our newsletter so that you can hear about events like this. And you can do that at msje.org/newsletter. And I thank you all so much for being here. And one other thing, folks in person, you can buy the book right now. Folks online, our museum store is selling And the Dead Shall Rise, and we invite you to purchase your book through there. Thank you for joining us so much today, and we'll see you next time.